My son slid the papers across the table and told me it was for my own good, and I almost laughed. I remember the way Daniel avoided my eyes when he said it, like a boy who already knew he was doing something wrong but hoped I wouldn't notice. Olivia, sitting beside him, smiled that polished, careful smile she wore whenever she wanted something, her fingers resting lightly on his arm as if guiding him through the moment. We were seated in my dining room, the same room where I had hosted every Thanksgiving for the past 30 years, where Daniel used to sit in that very chair asking for seconds and telling me about his day. The late afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the table, and for a brief second, everything looked exactly the same as it always had. But it wasn't. "It's just a formality, Mom," Daniel said, tapping the stack of papers with 2 fingers, his tone too casual, too rehearsed. "We're just trying to make things easier for you." Easier. That word lingered in the air like something artificial, something carefully chosen. I looked down at the documents without touching them, my hands folded neatly in my lap. The title alone told me everything I needed to know. Transfer of ownership. Not assistance. Not management. Ownership. Olivia leaned slightly forward, her voice soft, almost sweet. "This house is a lot to handle, Margaret. And the company, too. You've done so much already. It's time to let us take care of things." I nodded slowly, as if considering her words, though my mind had already moved several steps ahead. I had noticed the changes weeks ago. The sudden interest in my schedule. The quiet questions about my accounts. The way Daniel had started using phrases that didn't sound like him, words that felt borrowed, like lines memorized for a role he didn't quite believe in. I had noticed everything. "You trust us, don't you?" Olivia added gently. That was the moment Daniel finally looked at me.
Not confidently.
Not firmly. Just a quick glance, like he was checking to see if I would make this easy for him. I met his eyes and held them there for a second longer than he expected. Long enough for him to look away again. I let out a small breath and reached forward, placing my fingertips on the edge of the papers without pulling them closer. The room was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that reveals more than words ever could. I thought about the years that had led to this moment. The sacrifices. The late nights. The risks his father and I had taken to build something that would last. Something stable. Something real. And now, here it was, reduced to a stack of documents and a conversation dressed up as concern. "Of course," I said softly, my voice calm, steady, giving nothing away. "If this is what you think is best." Olivia's smile widened just slightly. Daniel exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing as if a weight had been lifted. They thought they had already won. That was the first mistake. Because what they didn't know, what neither of them had bothered to understand, was that nothing they were trying to take had ever been within their reach to begin with. And as I sat there, looking at my son and the woman beside him, I realized something with absolute clarity. I wasn't the one losing control. I was the only one who had ever had it. I did not sign the papers that afternoon, not really, not in the way they believed I had. I let the pen hover just long enough to make it convincing, just long enough for Daniel to relax into his chair and for Olivia to exchange that quiet, satisfied glance with him. They thought hesitation meant weakness, that silence meant surrender. They had always mistaken my restraint for something fragile. I placed the pen down gently and slid the documents back toward them with a small, almost absent smile, as if the matter had already been settled in their favor. "I trust you," I said, and the words sounded exactly the way they wanted them to sound. That was important. Everything about that moment had to feel effortless to them, natural, inevitable. Olivia reached for the papers quickly, too quickly, her fingers smoothing the edges as though she was already claiming them. Daniel leaned back, his shoulders finally loosening, his expression shifting from tension to something dangerously close to relief. It was subtle, but I saw it. I always saw more than they thought I did. After they left, the house returned to its usual quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now.
Not
empty. Not lonely. Just still. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the same sounds that had filled this home for decades. Everything looked the same, but the meaning behind it had changed. I walked slowly into the living room and ran my fingers along the back of the leather chair Daniel's father used to sit in every evening. He had always been careful, deliberate, never trusting appearances alone. Ownership is not what people think it is, he once told me, years ago when we were first building the company together. It is not about whose name people see. It is about who holds the truth behind it. At the time, I had not fully understood what he meant. Now I did. I moved toward the small desk by the window and opened the drawer without hesitation. Inside, neatly arranged and untouched, were copies of documents Daniel had never seen, records Olivia had never asked about, details they had both assumed were irrelevant or outdated. They had been looking in all the obvious places, asking all the predictable questions, never realizing that the real answers had never been where they expected them to be. I picked up one of the folders and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it in my hands, not heavy, but significant. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights briefly sweeping across the walls before disappearing again. Time moved forward, as it always did, steady and indifferent. I closed the drawer carefully and rested my hand on it for a second longer than necessary. Daniel believed he was stepping into control, that he was finally taking charge of something that had always been just out of reach. Olivia believed she had guided him there, that she had shaped the outcome with careful patience and quiet influence. They both believed the same thing in different ways. That I was finished. That I had become something to manage, something to transition, something to quietly move aside. I walked back toward the dining room, my steps slow, measured, the same way they had been earlier, the same way they would be tomorrow. Nothing about me had changed. That was the part they did not understand. I did not need to react. I did not need to argue. I did not need to prove anything in that moment. Because everything they were planning depended on a version of me that no longer existed, and everything I was about to do depended on the fact that they had never taken the time to see who I had become. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I could not sleep, but because I had already slept enough. There was a certain clarity that came with knowing exactly where you stood, and for the first time in a long while, I felt no confusion, no hesitation, only a quiet sense of direction. The house was still dark when I walked into the kitchen, the hardwood floors cool beneath my feet, the air carrying that faint stillness that only exists before sunrise. I prepared my coffee the same way I had every morning for years, measuring each scoop carefully, letting the routine anchor me in something steady and familiar. Outside the window, the sky slowly shifted from deep blue to pale gray, and I stood there watching it, holding the warm mug in both hands, thinking not about what had happened, but about what was already in motion. Daniel would wake up believing everything was settled. Olivia would likely be reviewing those documents again, maybe even discussing their next steps, confident in the outcome they thought they had secured. They would move forward quickly. People like them always did when they believed they were ahead. They did not pause to question. They did not look back to verify. They simply assumed. That assumption was going to be their weakness. I set the mug down and walked into the study, a room Daniel rarely entered anymore, a room he had slowly stopped noticing altogether. The desk was exactly as I had left it, clean, organized, everything in its place. I opened the top drawer and took out a small key, one that had not changed location in over 20 years. Some things only remain hidden because no one thinks to look for them. I crossed the room to the built-in cabinet and unlocked the lower compartment, revealing a thin metal box tucked neatly inside. It was not large. It did not need to be. Inside were the documents that mattered, not the copies, not the versions designed for appearance, but the originals, the ones that defined what was real and what was not. I lifted the lid and looked down at them for a moment, not with surprise, not with doubt, but with recognition. This was the foundation Daniel believed he understood, the structure Olivia thought she had mapped out piece by piece. But they had only seen the surface. They had only ever been allowed to see the surface. I closed the box carefully and locked it again, returning the key to the drawer without a second thought. There was no urgency in my movements, no rush, no sign of concern. Everything that needed to happen would happen at the right time, not a moment sooner. By the time the sun had fully risen, the house looked exactly as it always did, calm, orderly, unchanged. I moved through each room with the same quiet presence, adjusting nothing, disturbing nothing, allowing the illusion to remain intact. Because that was the most important part. Not what they saw, but what they believed they saw. And as I stood by the window, watching the light settle across the front yard, I realized something simple and undeniable. They had already taken their step. They had already committed to a path they could not reverse. And all I had to do now was let them walk it, one confident step at a time, until they reached the point where there was nowhere left to go but the truth. It was not always this way, and that was perhaps the most difficult part to accept, not the betrayal itself, but how quietly it had taken shape over time. I could trace it back now, piece by piece, like following a thread that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. There had been small moments, almost forgettable at the time, moments I had dismissed because it was easier to believe in family than to question it. I remembered the first time Daniel had suggested changing something in the company without asking me directly, presenting it instead as a decision that had already been discussed with Olivia. He had said it casually, almost as an afterthought, as though my approval was a formality rather than a necessity. I had nodded then, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. That had been my mistake. Then there were the holidays that slowly stopped feeling like gatherings and began to feel like obligations. Olivia would take control of the conversations, guiding them in subtle directions, steering decisions, reframing plans in ways that always seemed reasonable on the surface, but gradually shifted everything away from me. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. Control does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply settles in, unnoticed, until it becomes the new normal. I remembered a Sunday afternoon not long ago, sitting in this same dining room, listening as they discussed renovations to the house as though it already belonged to them. New furniture, structural changes, even the idea of converting my study into something more useful. I had been sitting right there, my hands folded, listening to them redesign my life without ever asking if I wanted it redesigned. And still, I had said nothing. Not because I did not see it, but because I wanted to understand how far they were willing to go. That was the question that stayed with me. Not whether they would try, but how much they believed they could take without resistance. Daniel had changed too, though more quietly. He spoke less when it came to me, deferred more often, let Olivia fill the silence where he once would have stepped in. It was not sudden. It was gradual, almost careful, like watching someone slowly step out of a room without wanting to be noticed. And I had let him. I had watched it happen, waiting, observing, measuring. Because deep down I knew something they did not. This was not about one conversation, or one set of papers, or one decision made at a table. This had been building for a long time, shaped by assumptions they had never bothered to question. They believed I was aging out of relevance, that time itself was quietly removing me from the center of things. They believed patience meant surrender, that silence meant acceptance. They believed the foundation beneath them was stable because they had never seen it shift. But foundations do not reveal themselves to those who never built them. I stood by the window again, looking out at the street where Daniel used to ride his bicycle as a child, where he would fall and get back up without hesitation, trusting that I was always there watching. I had always been there. That had never changed. What had changed was what he thought that meant. And as I stood there, remembering the boy he had been and the man he had become, I understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. They had not just underestimated me. They had built their entire plan on that mistake. The call came later that afternoon, just as the light in the house began to soften and stretch across the floors in long, quiet lines. I recognized the number immediately, even though it had been months since I had last seen it appear on my phone. I let it ring once, twice, before answering, not out of hesitation, but because timing matters more than most people realize. Margaret, the voice said, steady and familiar, carrying with it a weight that did not need to be explained. It has been a while. It has, I replied calmly, walking into the study and closing the door behind me with a soft click. I was wondering when you would call. There was a brief pause on the other end, not confusion but recognition. He understood that I was not surprised. I have been reviewing some activity connected to your company, he continued, his tone measured, precise. Unusual requests. Attempts to access ownership records. Nothing has gone through, but someone is trying. I moved toward the desk, resting my hand lightly against its surface as I listened. I assumed as much, I said, my voice even, giving nothing away. Do you have a name? Another pause, shorter this time. Not officially, he said. But the inquiries are not subtle. They are coming from someone who believes they already have authority. I allowed myself a small, quiet breath, not of relief, but of confirmation. Everything was aligning exactly as expected. Then we should not interrupt them, I replied. Not yet. There was a shift in his tone then, a subtle change that reflected both understanding and caution. Margaret, he said carefully, if this is what I think it is, you should be aware that they are moving quickly. They are preparing something formal. I looked down at the desk, at the clean surface that revealed nothing of what it held beneath. Yes, I said. They already have. Silence settled between us for a moment, not uncomfortable, but deliberate. He had known me long enough to understand that I did not speak without reason. What would you like me to do? He asked finally. I turned slightly, my gaze drifting toward the window, where the last of the daylight was beginning to fade. Nothing that draws attention, I said. But I want everything ready. Every record, every original document, every verification. I want it all in one place. Understood, he replied without hesitation. And Margaret, he added, his voice lowering just slightly, are you certain you want to let this continue? I considered the question, not because I needed time to answer, but because I wanted to be precise. They have already decided what they believe is true, I said quietly. If I stop them now, they will only adjust. They will become more careful, more cautious, and they will try again. I let that settle for a moment before continuing. But if I let them proceed, if I let them commit fully to what they think they understand, then there will be no adjustment. No retreat. Only one outcome. He did not respond immediately, but I could hear the understanding in his silence. Then I will make sure everything is prepared, he said finally. When the time comes, there will be no question about what is real. That is exactly what I need, I replied. After the call ended, I remained standing there for a moment, the quiet of the room returning as if nothing had happened. Outside, the sky had darkened, the last traces of daylight slipping away without resistance. I walked back into the dining room slowly, my steps measured, my expression unchanged. From the outside, nothing had shifted. The house was still, the air calm, everything exactly as it should be. But beneath that stillness, something had already been set in motion, something that could not be undone. And as I stood there, looking at the same table where Daniel had placed those papers just hours earlier, I realized something with absolute certainty. They were no longer testing the boundaries. They had already crossed them. And now, all that remained was to let them discover what they had stepped into. The following day unfolded exactly as I expected, not because I could predict every word they would say, but because I understood the pattern they were following. By mid-morning, Daniel called, his voice lighter than it had been in weeks, carrying a confidence that did not belong to him. Mom, I was thinking, he said, as though the thought had just occurred to him. We should finalize everything soon. No reason to drag it out. I stood by the kitchen counter, listening, letting a brief pause settle between us before responding. Of course, I said gently. Whenever you think is best. There was a subtle shift in his tone then, a quiet satisfaction, as if my agreement confirmed something he had already decided. How about Friday? He suggested. We can meet at the office, get everything signed properly. I glanced toward the window, watching a bird land briefly on the fence before lifting off again. Friday works, I replied. Send me the details. When the call ended, I placed the phone down with the same care I had used for everything else. No sudden movements, no signs of urgency. Across town, I could almost see it unfolding without needing to be there. Olivia reviewing the documents again, perhaps making minor adjustments, ensuring every detail aligned with what she believed to be a clean transfer. Daniel nodding along, trusting her confidence more than his own understanding. They would be thorough, but only within the limits of what they thought mattered. That was always the weakness of people who believed they were in control. They only checked what they expected to find. I spent the rest of the morning exactly as I always did, moving through the house with quiet consistency, watering the plants, folding laundry, maintaining the rhythm that had defined my days for years. Nothing about me changed, and that was precisely the point. By the afternoon, an email arrived, the subject line simple and direct. Appointment confirmation. I opened it without hesitation, scanning the details with calm precision. Time, location, names. Everything appeared exactly as it should, polished, official, convincing. I noticed the law firm listed at the bottom, unfamiliar to me in name, but not in function. Olivia's choice, no doubt. She would have selected someone she believed would move quickly, someone who would not question what appeared to be a straightforward transition. I closed the email and sat back for a moment, letting the silence of the room settle around me. They had chosen the stage. They had set the time. They believed they were directing the outcome. I reached for my phone again and made a single call, brief and precise, confirming that everything on my side would be ready when the moment arrived. There were no long discussions, no elaborate instructions. There did not need to be. The preparation had already been done. The pieces were already in place. All that remained was the timing. As the day moved into evening, the house filled once again with that familiar quiet, steady and unchanged. I prepared dinner for myself, ate at the same table, in the same chair, with the same calm presence I had carried through every part of this process. To anyone watching, there would have been nothing unusual, nothing to suggest that anything significant was approaching. And that was exactly how it needed to be. Because the most effective moments are not the ones announced in advance. They are the ones that arrive quietly, without warning, when everyone involved believes they already understand what is about to happen. Friday was not going to be a negotiation. It was not going to be a discussion. It was going to be a revelation. And the most important part was that they had chosen it themselves. Friday arrived without ceremony, just another morning that began the same way as all the others, quiet, steady, predictable. I woke early, dressed with the same care I always had, choosing a simple navy dress, the kind that did not draw attention but never went unnoticed. There was something about routine that calmed people, something that made them believe everything was under control. I poured my coffee, took a slow sip, and looked around the kitchen, letting my eyes rest on familiar details as if nothing beyond them mattered. But beneath that stillness, everything was already in place. By the time I left the house, the sun had risen fully, casting a clear light across the street, revealing everything without hiding a single detail. The drive to the office was uneventful, the roads familiar, the traffic light. I did not rush. There was no reason to. When I arrived, I noticed Daniel's car already parked outside, positioned neatly, as if he had arrived early to prepare himself. Olivia's car was beside it, perfectly aligned, just as deliberate. They were ready, or at least they believed they were. I stepped inside the building, the air cool and controlled, the quiet hum of professional order surrounding everything. A receptionist greeted me politely, her smile practiced, her tone neutral. I gave my name and she nodded, already expecting me, already part of a process that had been arranged without my input, but not without my awareness. "They are waiting for you," she said, gesturing toward a hallway lined with closed doors. I walked down that hallway at the same measured pace I had carried through the entire week, my footsteps soft against the carpet, my posture straight, my expression calm. When I entered the room, Daniel stood up immediately, his movement quick, almost eager, while Olivia remained seated for just a moment longer before rising more gracefully, her smile already in place. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice warm in a way that felt practiced, not natural. "You made it." "Of course," I replied simply, taking a seat across from them. The table between us was neatly arranged, documents stacked, pens aligned, everything prepared with a level of detail that suggested finality. Olivia glanced at the lawyer seated at the head of the table, a man I did not recognize, but whose role was clear from the way he organized the papers with quiet authority. "We have everything ready," she said, her tone smooth, confident. This should not take long. I nodded once, folding my hands in front of me, allowing my gaze to move briefly across the room, noting every detail without appearing to focus on anything at all. Daniel sat down again, leaning slightly forward, his attention fixed on the documents as if they already belonged to him. Olivia mirrored his posture, her confidence steady, her composure intact. They were both so certain. The lawyer began to speak, outlining the process in clear, formal terms, explaining each step as though it were routine, as though nothing about this moment carried any weight beyond procedure. I listened without interruption, my expression unchanged, my presence quiet but unwavering. When he finished, he turned slightly toward me, sliding the first document across the table. "If you are ready, we can begin," he said. I looked down at the paper, then back up at him, then briefly at Daniel and Olivia, who were watching me with careful anticipation, their expectations already shaping what they believed would happen next. I reached for the pen, my movements slow, deliberate, controlled. And in that moment, as the room settled into a silence filled with certainty that did not belong to me, I understood something with absolute clarity. They had built everything on what they thought they knew. And in just a few seconds, they were about to learn how little that truly was. I held the pen just above the paper, letting the silence stretch for a fraction longer than anyone expected, not long enough to raise suspicion, but long enough to shift the rhythm of the room. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still, while Olivia's eyes remained fixed on the document, her expression composed but alert. They were waiting for a simple action, a signature, a quiet confirmation of everything they believed had already been decided. Instead, I lowered the pen slowly and set it down without touching the paper. "Before we begin," I said calmly, my voice steady and even, "I would like to review something." The lawyer at the head of the table paused, his hand resting lightly on the folder in front of him. Daniel blinked, just once, as if recalibrating, while Olivia's smile held, though it no longer reached her eyes. "Of course," the lawyer replied, though there was a slight hesitation in his tone. I reached into my bag and removed a thin folder, placing it gently on the table with a quiet precision that drew their attention without force. It was not large, not dramatic, but it did not need to be. I opened it slowly, turning it toward the lawyer first. "These are the original ownership documents," I said, not loudly, not with emphasis, just as a simple statement of fact. The lawyer leaned forward, his expression shifting almost immediately as he scanned the first page, then the next, his posture straightening in a way that suggested something had changed. Daniel glanced between us, confusion beginning to surface in small, controlled movements, while Olivia's composure tightened, her gaze sharpening as she tried to follow what was happening without yet understanding it. "I believe," I continued, "that before any transfer is discussed, it would be appropriate to confirm the current legal structure." The lawyer cleared his throat lightly, adjusting the documents in front of him. "Yes," he said slowly, his tone now more formal, more careful. "That would be appropriate." He reached for the papers I had brought, comparing them with the ones already on the table, his eyes moving back and forth with increasing focus. The room grew quieter, not with anticipation now, but with something else, something less certain. Daniel shifted in his chair, his earlier confidence beginning to falter, replaced by a subtle tension he could not fully hide. "What is this?" he asked, his voice controlled but edged with something unfamiliar. I did not look at him immediately. I let the lawyer speak first. "These documents indicate," the lawyer said carefully, "that the property and the company are held under a structure that has not been reflected in the transfer paperwork provided." Olivia leaned forward now, her calm slipping just slightly. "That is not possible," she said, her voice still measured but no longer smooth. "We reviewed everything." The lawyer did not respond right away. He continued reading, turning another page, then another, each movement deliberate, each second stretching the distance between what they believed and what was actually true. Finally, he looked up, his expression composed but unmistakably changed. "The current legal owner," he said, his voice clear, leaving no room for interpretation, "is Margaret Whitmore." sole and primary, with full controlling interest. There is no pending transfer. There has never been a transfer. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality that did not need to be emphasized. Daniel's hand stilled completely on the table, his expression caught between disbelief and realization, while Olivia's posture froze for just a moment before she leaned back slightly, her mind already searching for an explanation that did not exist. I folded my hands once more, resting them lightly in front of me, my expression unchanged, my voice calm when I finally spoke. I thought it would be important, I said, to make sure we were all working from the same understanding. No one spoke immediately after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was suddenly too much that could not be said without unraveling everything they had built their confidence on. The lawyer lowered the documents slowly, placing them side by side with the ones Daniel had brought, the difference between them now impossible to ignore. Daniel's gaze moved from the papers to me, searching for something familiar, something he could still recognize, but what he found instead was something he had never taken the time to understand. "Mom," he said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of the certainty it had carried before, this does not make sense." I met his eyes calmly, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a clarity that left no room for confusion. "It makes perfect sense," I replied. Olivia leaned forward again, her composure no longer smooth, her words coming faster now, sharper. "There has to be a mistake. We went through everything. Every record, every statement." The lawyer glanced at her briefly, then back at the documents, his tone measured and firm. "There is no mistake," he said. "What you reviewed were surface records. These are the governing documents. They override everything else." Olivia's lips pressed together, her mind moving quickly, trying to find another angle, another explanation, but the space for that had already closed. Daniel sat back slowly, his hands now resting flat against the table, no longer tapping, no longer moving. He looked at the papers again, then at me, and for the first time, there was no assumption in his expression, only realization. I let the silence settle once more before speaking, not to explain, not to justify, but simply to state what had always been true. "You were looking for ownership in the wrong places," I said quietly. "You thought it was something you could access, something you could transfer, something you could take if you arranged it properly." I paused for a moment, letting the words land without pressure. "But what you were trying to take was never structured that way." Daniel exhaled slowly, as if something inside him had finally shifted into place, though not in the way he had expected. Olivia did not speak again. She sat back, her posture controlled but rigid, her expression carefully neutral, though the calculation behind it had nowhere left to go. I reached for the folder I had brought and closed it gently, sliding it back toward me with the same calm precision I had carried from the beginning. "There is nothing here to sign," I continued, my tone steady, final without needing emphasis. "Not for me." The lawyer nodded slightly, already understanding the conclusion before it was spoken aloud. Daniel looked down at the papers one last time, then pushed them forward just a fraction, as if acknowledging something he could no longer deny. The room felt different now, not tense, not loud, just clear, as though everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only what was real. I stood up slowly, smoothing my hands lightly against the table before stepping back. There was no need for anything more, no need for raised voices or long explanations. I had not lost anything. I had not been taken by surprise. I had simply allowed them to walk far enough to see where they truly stood. I looked at Daniel once more, not as the man sitting across from me, but as the boy who had once trusted that I understood things he did not yet see. "You did not lose anything today," I said quietly. "You just learned what was never yours." Then I turned and walked toward the door, my step steady, my expression unchanged, leaving behind everything they had brought into that room, because none of it had ever belonged to me in the way they believed.